I wish to stop.
War with Russia may or may not be upon us. NATO, assemble.
NATO is a military alliance that I'm sure you've heard about on the news before. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is an intergovernmental military alliance between 32 member countries, 30 in Europe, and 2 in North America, and technically 1 in Asia, since Turkey is technically a part of both Europe and Asia. But how did the North Atlantic Treaty Organization start in the first place? Well, Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, but the war in the Pacific continued. At this point America, Britain, and the Soviet Union were allies during the war. They held a couple of conferences near the end of the war, to decide what would happen next. However, America, and the Soviet Union were now the two main superpowers after the war. And they both had very different views on how the world should look. Throughout Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union set up puppet communist governments to be a buffer between the USSR and the West. On March 5, 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, UK Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, proclaimed, an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast. Over the next few years, the British intervened in the Greek Civil War to prevent a communist takeover. In Turkey, the Soviets demanded more access of Turkey's sea routes, which in turn, prompted the US to send their largest warship to Turkey. In 1949, United States initiated the Marshall Plan. This would help the refunding of Europe, and in turn, greater cooperation between European countries and the United States. Berlin was a contemptuous point. Caught over 100 miles behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the Allies, and the western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin. Stalin wanted to put a stop to it. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets blockaded all supply routes to West Berlin. The Soviets were hoping that the Allies would just abandon the city, but they weren't going to do that. On June 26, 1948, the Allies began the Berlin airlift, dropping supplies, for people in West Berlin. The Soviets eventually gave up and lifted the blockade. A Soviet-sponsored coup in Czechoslovakia also resulted in a full communist takeover, in February 1948. The North Atlantic Treaty would be signed on April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C. 12 countries signed it, and became its members. They were the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Italy and finally Portugal. If the Soviet Union dared attack any of these countries, then this new alliance would go to war with the USSR. Now, the United States could have a military presence in Europe, which enables a more immediate retaliation, in case of a Soviet attack. This extended to a doctrine of massive retaliation, where NATO members would use nuclear weapons on the USSR, as a last resort. This would also enable these countries to spend more on their economies, rather than large-scale armies. The collective power of the 12 nations who promised to defend each other if one was attacked, worked as a deterrent, demonstrating to the Soviet Union that Western Europe would defend itself against Soviet aggression. Expansionism of smaller countries would also now be more secure as a result of having more powerful nations defending them. But then something really bad happens. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear bomb. If war broke out between NATO, it would become a dangerous situation. More countries would join NATO later, including Greece and Turkey in 1952. Turkey would want to join NATO, due to Soviet pressure on them, and the fear of an invasion. West Germany would join 1955, which would really scare the Soviets. So they formed their own defensive pact, known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact made up 8 countries: the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, Hungary, and East Germany. But the Warsaw Pact was heavily influenced and controlled by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union actually attempted to join NATO in 1954, but were rejected, as they feared this would destabilize NATO. On March 7, 1966, France would leave the integrated military command of NATO. NATO headquarters and military command are then moved to Belgium. In 1974, after an attempted coup in Cyprus, Turkey invades the north part of Cyprus. Greece was unhappy with this, and also leaves NATO integrated command. In the following years, the USSR develops and installs new more powerful nuclear missiles that threaten Western Europe more precisely. In reaction, NATO decides to install new missiles in 5 member countries, while attempting to initiate a policy of détente with the USSR. In 1980, Greece returns to the Integrated Command. After the death of Francisco Franco, in 1975, Spain joins NATO in 1982 as they return back to a democracy. However, Soviet Union is weakened due to many problems back home. In February of 1991, the Warsaw Pact is dissolved. Republics, within the USSR, would slowly leave the Union. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, meaning the West won the Cold War. Now there is a question if NATO was important or not. NATO would still remain. Yugoslavia is weakened by independence movements. The NATO Air Force is given the task of patrolling to enforce the resolution. Serbia also starts committing genocide to Albanians, living in Kosovo after they start to fight for independence. 45 years after its creation, NATO engages in its first combat. NATO begins bombing campaigns against Bosnian Serb forces, which intensify until the signing of a peace treaty on June 9, 1999. An international peacekeeping force, under NATO command, is then established to ensure peace. After years of meetings and talks, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO on March 12, 1999. In the year 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton and Russian President Vladimir Putin meet to discuss the possibility of Russia joining NATO. The debate got heated when Russia told Bill Clinton that Russia must be personally invited. Bill Clinton said he wasn't going to give Russia special treatment. After the 9/11 attacks, NATO sent forces to Afghanistan. It later got involved in Iraq, Libya, and fighting pirates near Somalia. Meanwhile, NATO continued to grow. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia all joined in 2004, while Albania and Croatia joined in 2009. This made Russia very nervous, as former Russian territories were joining NATO for protection against Russia. Ukraine and Georgia would also then try and join NATO, which was the final straw for Putin. He launched an invasion of Georgia in August 7, 2008, to protect 2 rebelling areas of Georgia. On February 20, 2014, Russia invaded and occupied Crimea. Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast started rebelling against Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin launched a special military operation, with a full military invasion of Ukraine. NATO became extremely scared of this war. For decades, they have been laying back on many of their militaries, since the Cold War has been over. Now, Russia was a huge threat again. In May 2022, Finland and Sweden officially announced that they wanted to join NATO. This would put Russia in an even worse position as now they would be completely surrounded by NATO. On April 4, 2023, Finland would join NATO, and Sweden would join a year later on March 7, 2024. To this day, NATO is still a strong alliance but is facing concerns with Donald Trump hinting he may leave NATO.